Without wasting any time, let's see how we can build layouts using Flexbox and CSS Grid. In this part, we are not going to be working on our project. We are simply going to concentrate on understanding Flexbox and CSS Grid. So now I am on my desktop, and here I am going to create a new folder which I'm going to call layout, or simply call it CSS layout. So to open this folder, remember on Windows, you can simply right click on this folder and open it with your code editor. And on Mac, you can simply open your Visual Studio Code and drag and drop this folder. So here I'm going to create a file and I'm going to call it index.html. Let's simply use the shortcut to generate the HTML boilerplate. So simply press Shift and exclamation mark and hit Tab. So in here, let's change the title to layout. So inside the body, all I'm going to put here is simply a div with a class of container. And next, I'm going to have a div. And here I am going to give it a class of child. So if you notice, I am using a shortcut. So you can also do something like you write this way. And here I am going to give it a class of child and also child1. So to do what I am doing previously, you simply type div and you write dot, then write the class name and tab. Hit tab is going to generate the div and assign the class name. Now I am also going to show you another shortcut. So let's say you want to generate div and you want maybe 5 divs. Multiply by 5, that is div multiply by 5, and hit tab is going to generate 5 divs for you. This also works with any element. So even if it's the P and maybe you need 4, it will also do the same thing. So this is a handy shortcut. So here, let's say a div and also a class of child. So here, let's add 4 more divs, and this is going to generate 4 divs with a class of child. So here, let's now say child, and here, let's just copy this child and put it here. So in this session, this is actually another new concept we've not seen in the previous series. So here we have this class and we are specifying 2 classes. So it is possible to actually specify more than 1 class. So an element can have 3 classes, 4 classes, depending on what you want. And let's also add this, and this now should be 5. And for this, so let's put this, and this should be 6. So here, let's say here, let's write great, let's write Bob, John. Here, let's write building. Here, let's write hope. You can write anything you want. And here, let's write joy. This is all we need in order to start learning Flexbox. So remember, the next thing we need to do is to create our style sheet. So we can now create another file here. So let's call it style.css. All right. So now we need to link this style sheet to our HTML. Remember how we did that? So we simply use the link element. And in here now, we need to specify. So you could simply write dot and put slash. So you are going to see style.css. Now let's see if this works, if everything is set up correctly. So here we have this class of container. So it should be dot container. And for now, let's simply give it a background color, green, and let's save this file. Now to run this particular project, we can simply click on this go live. If you are just joining us, we installed an extension which is called the live server. So this particular extension, I already have it installed. So you can click on install. Now, when you install that, you will see this go live icon. So simply click on this and good, we have this. So let's go back to the style sheet, and on the container, we gave it a background color of green. So let's add some margin, maybe a margin of 30 pixels, okay, just to give a space around the container. And let's increase the font size. So here, let's say 18 pixels, or give it a font size of 20 pixels. Now we want to style each of these particular divs. So we have child 1, child 2. So let's simply select the first one, and here let's give it a background color. Okay, we have that. Let's select every other one, and now we have this. Okay, good. Now let's start learning Flexbox. Before we start with the Flexbox, I just want you to understand something. On our HTML document, you see that we have this children div inside a parents div. So this in here is the parents container containing every other one. So to use a Flexbox, you must have a parent container like this. You must have the parent elements. Inside the parent element, you now have what we call the flex items. So as the name implies, Flexbox, so you must have a box. In this place, this container is serving as the box. So inside the box, you now have the box items, which is called the flex item. So to use Flexbox in CSS, it is very simple. All you need to do is to set on the parent container, we simply set the display to flex. So in here now, we could simply say display, and we set it to flex. And let's go back to the page. And you see now, by default, everything, like each of the div, becomes just a row. And the row is what we call the flex direction. So the flex direction could be either row or column. So if we go back here and change back the flex direction, the default is the row. So if you save this, you have the same result. But when you change this to column and save this file, you have what we had before. All right. So now we can also do one more thing. So let's save this back. And let's do one more thing, justify content. And here, let's say justify content to center. So what this does is going to make sure that all the items are at the center horizontally. So justifying content center is going to align the items horizontally and is going to place them at the center. We also have the flex start. So if you save this file, this should now be at the beginning here. So let's save this. You see now it's at the beginning. We also have the flex end, and I'm sure you know, yeah, this is going to be at the end. So by default, it is the stretch. So by default, it is the stretch. And that means that each of the flex item is going to take the space required, the space needed for the content. So if you look at the great is actually longer than Bob, and you see that great took more space because it's going to take the space required to fit in the content. So that is the default behavior. So we also have what we call space between. So you can set this to space between. And what it's going to do is going to take the remaining space and distribute it evenly among the flex item. This is very useful in practice. You will always see justify content, space between, justify content, center. This is very important. Now we also have the space around. So here we could use space around. And when you save this file, there's going to be a space here, a space here. So let's save the file. And you see the space here. Then you have equal space, equal space, equal space. And the space here and here, they are the same thing. Now let's change this back to space between. And now let's look at what we call align items. So we can align items to the center. Now, before we continue, let's actually go to one of the flex item. And in here, let's set the height. Let's say the height should be 80 pixels. And let's save this. Now, let's remove these align items and save this file. Each of these flex item actually takes only the space required to fit the content. So here, this is this space between. So if we remove this for now and save this file again, so this is the remaining space. This is because the background color is green. So we can also remove this background color for now, but we needed it to understand some concepts. So let's leave it for now. But what I want you to note is when you set the height, so by default, each of the flex item horizontally, this is the horizontal direction. So horizontally, they are all going to take the space required to fit the content. But vertically, they are going to take the height of the item that has the highest height. So by default, when you set height on any of the flex item, all other flex item, they are going to adjust to the highest height. You see, they are going to adjust to that height. Now, for child 3, we redefined the height to be 60 pixels. And that's why you see here, you see 60 pixels, and then you see this space. So let's remove this for now. And let's only leave this. So now let's see let's return the justify content, and now let's use the space between as we've seen before. Now let's now see what align items does. So let's say align items to the center, and you save this. You see that is going to align the items to the center. This bulb still remains like this because bulb has height of 80 pixels. And that is why you see this like this. And you see all other items aligned to the center. What happens when we change the align item to flex and save this file? You see the items are pushed to the end of the flexbox. This has a fixed height, so it remains like that. Now, if you look at this, this shows that align items is used to align the items inside the flexbox vertically, while justify content is used to justify the content horizontally. If I want to move all of them to this side, I will simply use justify content, and I'm going to use flex and save this file. And you see horizontally it is moving. To move vertically, you use the align items. Now, what happens if I want a space between them? And I already have justifying content to be flex end, but I still want some space here. And we can use what we call gap. So we can set the gap to, let's say, 2 pixels. And when you save this file, you see the tiny gap here. You see a tiny gap. Let's increase this to 20 pixels. And now you see the gap. I hope now you are beginning to see how Flexbox works. And it will make more sense when we start applying this to a project. Now, the next thing we want to look at, now all these properties, display flex, justify content, align items, they are properties that are used on the flex container itself. And what happens for child 1 if I don't want child 1 to be flex end? How do I actually change this? So this leads us to property that are specially made for the flex item. So for the child one now, I can come here and I can use what we call the align self. So if I use align self and I do flex start and save this, let's see what happens. You see, this actually moved up. So let's also do the same thing with beauty, which is the fourth child. So for fourth child, currently all of them are at, you see here, align items, they are all flex end. Now for the fourth child, let's actually change the align item. But here we cannot use align items because align item is a property on the flex container itself. Instead, we use align self. And in this case, we could simply say center. And when you save this file, beauty should not be at the center. So this is how you can simply move the flex items. So the next property we are going to look at, which is also the flex item property, is what we call the flex itself. So this flex actually requires three property values. The first one is what we call the flex grow, and by default it is 0. The second one is what we call the flex shrink, and by default it is 1. And the third one is what we call the flex basis, and by default it is auto. So let's save this file. We still have the same result because now we only use the default value. So now before we use this shorthand, let's actually write everything one after the other so that you understand more clearly. So here, let's set the flex. So the first one is what we call the flex grow. And for now, maybe we should just set it to 1 and see what happens. When you go back to the page, you see that the first child, which is this one, actually takes up the remaining space. So it grows and takes up the remaining space. Now, if you go back to child 2 and set flex grow, so here, let's set flex grow to 1. What do you think is going to happen? The child 2 and child 1, they are going to share the remaining space equally. So let's go back, and child 2, so this is child 2 and this is child 1. So child 1 is this red here. Child 2 is full height because child 2 has height of 80 pixels, but you see that it occupies the same space, so it grows. By default, it is 0 because Flexbox by default does not allow the grow. So by default, it is 0. And this means that it's going to take only the space required for the content. But now let's practice and change this for 1. Now, what happens if we now change this one to 2 and leave this one at 1? Let's actually do something like this, and let's close this to have more space so that you clearly understand what we are doing. So on child 1, we set flex grow to 1. On child 2, we set flex grow to 2. This means that the space, so the remaining space, is going to be divided into 3 parts. And child 2 is going to take 2 parts. Child 1 is going to take the remaining 1 part. As you see, the space for child 1, which is this, remember that this is a gap between them. This is the gap here. So the child 1 is simply half of Bob, as you see. Now, if you set child 1 to 2, that means 2 of them, they are going to have equal space. So they are going to divide the space into 4, and Bob is going to take 2, and child 2 is going to take 2. So it's like sharing the leftover food between child 1 and child 2. I hope you understand this. Now we can also set flex grow to all of them. So let's go back, let's remove this and save this. We have this again. Now remember, in our HTML, we add this general class, which is child. So up here now, let's grab the child. So each of the flex item actually has this property. Now let's set flex grow, and here let's set it to 1 and save this file. And as you see, each of them, so the remaining space is going to be distributed equally, and each of them, they are going to occupy the same space as you see here. This actually is not a must to use 1 here. You can use 8. If you set this to 8, it's still going to give you the same result because all of them are going to take equal space. So the remaining space in the parent container, which is the flex container, they are going to distribute it, and then they are going to grab equal space, and that is exactly what you see here. So in most cases, we set this to 1. So the next property we are going to look at is what we call the flex basis. So flex basis is just like setting width on flex items. So here we could set the flex basis to, let's say, 100 pixels and save this file. You see now that the width actually increased. So that is how flex basis, flex grow works. Flex shrink by default is 1 because CSS makes it in such a way that the flex items shrink to adjust to the size of the container. So if you set the flex shrink to 0, that means the flex content is not actually going to fit into the container when you are out of space. So in practice, the flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, we use the shorthand. So for instance, here I can simply write, so here we can remove this and we can write flex. So here in the flex, we can now pass the first one, which is the flex grow. By default, it is 0. The flex shrink is 1, and then the width is auto. All right, and you see the space at the back of the first child. This is because we justified content to the flex end. So we can change this back to space between or space around, but let's use space between. Good. Now we've seen the properties that are actually assigned to the flex items. There is one more properties that we can actually use on these flex items, and that is what we call the order. So here we have flex child 1. So child 1 is the first one. What happens if we want to move child 1 to the end? Now, by default, the order of each of these flex item, the order is 0. By default, their order is 0. So to actually push child 1, which is great, to the end, that means I'm going to assign any order that is greater than 0. So in this case, if I put 1 and save this, you see that great actually appears here. If I want joy to come here and now push great back, that means I'm going to set the order of the last child, which is the 6th child, joy. I'm going to set the order to any number that is greater than 1. So here, the highest one is 1. By default, it is 0. So here, if I set this to 2 and save this file, you see that joy is now here. Now, what happens if I want to move joy to be the first item, to be in Bob position? So that means joy, instead of using 2, I can use -1, because by default, the order is 0. So -1 is less than 0. That's why you see now that joy is now in this position. And I think this is enough for us to actually work with big projects for now. So in practice, everything you've seen in this lecture actually covers a good percent of what you are going to be working with. Next, let's quickly look at CSS Grid. Now I'm going to copy everything we add here and I'm going to paste it here. But instead of container, I'm going to give it container grid. Here, let's change. Okay, let's leave the name as the same thing. And let's go back to our CSS file. But there is something to change here, because here, let's just change this to, okay, let's change this to child grid. Here, let's say grid, and the same thing here. So if you're on Mac, you can simply press Option and you keep clicking here, and you could write grid. If you're on Windows, I think it should be Shift. So here, let's change this to child 1 grid. So Option and click here, 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 and here. Now let's change this to grid. Good. Now we have this. We don't have the same styles applied to them any longer. So let's now go to the CSS. So here, let's select the container and give it a background color. Let's use this light coral. Good. Let's give it a margin top to push it away from the Flexbox. So let's give it a margin top of 30 pixels. That is too small. Let's give it 60 pixels. Good. So let's increase the font size to 20 pixels. All right. Now let's grab all these ones. Let's grab the child. So it's going to be child 1 grid. So first, let's just give these different background colors. So here we can use yellow, green. Let's do the same thing for the remaining ones. And this is not child 1. This is child 6. Good. All right. Now this, you see now that this page is actually becoming very difficult to read. Let's simply add the comments here. And to add the comment in CSS, remember you write slash, you write star, and to close it up, you write star and backslash. And in here, let's just say grid or CSS grid. All right, now we can start learning CSS grid. Just like Flexbox, to actually use CSS grid, all we need to do is to set display to grid, as simple as this. And then when you set display to grid and save this file, there is no any change. So here we need to now specify what we call the grid template columns. The grid template columns. So here, let's say 100 pieces and 150 pieces. When you save this, you see now we have two columns, column 1 and column 2. Now what happens if we add, let's say 200 pieces here? You see now that we now have 3 columns, 1, 2, 3. So we can also specify the role. Like here, we specify the number of columns we want, and we are saying give us a column. The first one should be 100 pixels wide. The second one should be 150 pixels, and the third one is this. We can also do the same thing for the role, the grid template rules. And here we can specify 200 pixels and let's say 300 pixels. And when you save this file, you see now that we have the first rule and the second rule. And this is column. Now let's inspect this page. So expand this. Remember that this is the background color we set on the grid container. So let's go back here to our dev tool. So you can press Option Command I, and let's inspect this particular grid. So let's go to the second. This is the grid container. So on the grid container, you will see this grid here. Just click on this grid. When you click on this grid, you are going to have something like this. You see the numbers. So these numbers are what we call the grid lines. So the grid lines, for instance, for the column, so for the column is going to be the number of columns plus 1. And that is why we have 3 columns, 1, 2, and 3. But the numbers, the grid lines, ranges from 1 to 4. So that is the number of columns plus 1. The same thing for the row. So for the row is going to be, so here we add -4, but under this -4 there is 3. Let me see if I can increase. So let's go back to the code, and what I'm going to do on the flex container, we can set, instead of setting display to flex, let's set display to none for now. And now we don't see the flex container. So in CSS, when you want to hide some content, you can simply use display and set it to none. So now let's go back to this particular page, because this is very important. If you understand all this stuff you see here, you are going to like CSS Grid. And CSS Grid is very powerful, very, very powerful. You see this in almost every project you work with. So remember to actually use this. I'm going to close this and refresh this page again. What we did, we can either right click on this and inspect. When you click inspect, you see this element. Click on this grid. So here in this grid, once you click on this grid, you have the numbers here. So number 1, 2, 3, 4. These are what we call the grid lines. And for the row also, is going to be the number of rows plus 1. That is why you see 1, 2, and 3. So these are the grid lines. Now inside this, we have what we call the grid cells. So we have what we call the grid cells, which are all these that you see. Now, apart from the grid cells, we also have what we call gaps. So when we add some gaps, you are going to see this very well. And the last thing we are going to look at is what we call the grid track, which for now, it is not obvious, but let's go back to the code and I'm going to show you this more. But for now, I want you to understand how these numbers works, because it is very important to understand this, especially when we start working on each of these grid items. For instance, if we want to move Joy to this position, you must understand these numbers. You must understand these numbers for you to do that. So let's go back to the code. Now, the next question is, how do we actually add gaps? Remember, in Flexbox, we simply set gaps and then we can write anything we want. In Grid, in CSS Grid, we can also do the same thing. We can just set right gap and we can say 20 pixels and save this. And now you see this gap. You see the gap between them. Now, you can also set different gaps for columns and also for rows. So instead of using this gap, let's comment out this. And now let's come down and we have what we call the row gap and column gap. This is not available in Flexbox, but in Grid, in CSS Grid, we can simply set the row gap. And for the row gap, let's say 20 pixels. And now you see for the grid, because we now remove this, we commented this out, so there is no gap in the grid. But for the row, you see this 20 pixels. Now you can also set the column gap. So for the column gap, let's say 40 pixels. And now you see this double space among them. This is how you can simply space your grid items. So just like Flexbox, we also have what we call the justify contents. Now, if you look at this space, so let's go back to this. And for now, let's also comment out this particular gap and save this. So we have this space here. The question is, what happens if I want my items to be at the center? I don't just want this space. How do I deal with that? And the answer is, just like in Flexbox, you can simply use the justify content. And in this place, it is not flex start or flex end. It is simply end. So here you can say end. And as you see, the content is shifted to the end. We also have start, which I think that is the default. And we also have center. So you can play with this. And for center, you see that the content is in the center. We also have the align content, which is used on the old tracks. So on all these old tracks, we can also use the justify items and align items. So instead of justify content, we also have justify items. And here, let's use end. And you see what happens. Now, let's set this to start and save this file. You see what happens. Let's set this to center, and you now see what happens to the items. So the justify items actually works with each cell. You see each cell, but the justify content actually works with the tracks. So when we use the justify content, you saw that it works with the old tracks, while the justify items, each of the cell actually works with each of the cell. So you can play with all this and see how handy this is. For now, I'm going to comment out this. Before we look at some properties that are on each of these grid items, let's actually go back to the grid template columns. So in practice, most times we only use the grid template columns, but we do not use pieces for the width. So in practice, we do not use pieces for the width. We simply use what we call fraction, which is the FR. So see what happens if I set this to 1 FR and save this file. So that means the first column, which is this, is going to occupy the remaining space. So it's going to occupy the remaining space. It is not fixed. Using pieces on the grid template means that we are setting a fixed size. So most times you see something like this, 1 FR, and here also we can say 1 FR and save this file. You see that each of the column now have the same size. Now what happens if we set the second one to 2 FR? And when you save this file, you see that the second one occupied double of 1 FR, which is, of course, which makes sense. Now, in the case where we have 1 FR, we can use what we call the repeat function. So here we can simply use repeat, and we can specify the number of times it should be repeated. In our case, we want it 3, and now you specify the size. So if you save this, you now have this, which is the same thing as saying 1 FR, 1 FR. For now, let's actually look at some properties that are available on each of these items, just as we did on the Flexbox. Now, what if we want to move this cell, which is joy, to the position of grid? How can we achieve this? To do this, we use some properties that are actually meant for the grid items. So here we can use what we call the grid column. So we have the grid column, this, and for the grid column, so this is joy, but we want joy to be in this position. You see the column, this is the column, so it is 1 between 1 and 2. So we simply go here, we go to that particular element we want to move, which is joy, and here we specify 1 to 2, start from 1, end at 2. Now the column, that is the column. Now what about the row? The row, we want it to be in this position. The row also starts from 1 and ends at 2. So let's go, and here we set the grid row, and it's 1, 2. And now you see that joy now occupies the first space. Now let me pause the video, move John to Bob position. Move John to Bob position. Good luck. I hope you were able to do that. So let's go. John is this particular child, which is a child 3. And to do that, you simply set grid colon. So John is here, but we want to move it to from 3 to 4. So that is 3/4. And the grid role, so John is here, we want to move it here. Colon starts here to here. And row also starts 1 to 2. So the grid row should be 1/2. And when you save this file, you see now John is here. So please kindly play with this and you will see that this is actually fun. Now, what happens if instead of writing 1 to 2, I can also write 1 to -1? What do you think is going to happen if I do this? So it's simply saying John should start from row 1 to the end. John should just occupy all the space. We can also use what we call span. So what happens if you say span 2? We are going to get the same results because we are saying start from 1 and span 2. Move to start from 1 and span 2. That is span 2 rows. And we only have just 2 rows. So it's going to occupy everything. If you say span 1, that means it's going to just occupy the first, you see, it's going to occupy just the first row. So for now, I think this is enough. So all I want you to do is actually to pause the video. Just take your time and go through everything we've done. Review this, review everything we've done. So let's go back to the Flexbox and change the display back to Flex. So now we are going to have our Flexbox up here. Please, I want you to play with this. Take your time, spend some time to actually understand why all these things work the way they work and go through the videos again. Please, I'm begging you, once you understand everything we've done in this video, building any layout is going to be very simple for you. Everything you see on this page, almost everything, uses Flexbox and Grid. Up here, it is Flexbox. Here is Flexbox. Here is Grid. Almost everything here uses Flexbox and Grid. If you go to youtube.com, all this, like this particular session here, there is a Flexbox. So let's inspect this page actually. And remember to inspect this page. I already showed you several ways you can do this. And first, you can simply click on this icon. And when you move down, you can see more tools and you see the developer tools. Now let's inspect this page a little bit. Okay, now there is one more thing I'm going to show you. Here you can actually filter any property you are looking for. So let's look at the display property. So let's look at display, and you see here, you see even the first one, you have display of flex. You see display flex, flex direction colon, align items center. When you inspect all this page more, you are going to see that Flexbox and Grid is used in any website you visit. You are going to see Flexbox, Flex, Grid. Now, the old way of building layout is what we call the float. So I'm going to explain this after our main project, which is building the Upwork landing page. For now, I don't want to bother you about float because float is just the old school ways of building layout, and CSS Grid and Flexbox already replaced float. The question we previously asked was, when do we use Flexbox and when do we use Grid? And the answer is, when you are working with one-dimensional layout, you simply use Flexbox. When you are working with two-dimensional layout or more complicated layout, you use the CSS Grid. I hope this little play with Flexbox and Flex Grid help you understand this. And I'm going to see you in the next session where we are going to complete everything here. Thank you so much. And please, I appreciate your comments. Do not forget to like the video. Do not forget to share this video. Thank you so much and see you in the next session.